Hello, I am Bryan Fleishman and my partner Mark Marinelli and I use the Oral and Written Language Skills 2nd edition as our test for the gallery walk and test critique. We will first discuss some of the basics of the OWLS 2, how to use it, and finally, some of our thoughts on the test. We hope you find it interesting. The OWLS 2 has 4 subtests, but we will only focus on the listening comprehension and oral expression scales. The author, as we see here, is Dr. Elizabeth Caro Woolfork, PhD. We can use the test on students aged 3 to 21. As you can see at the station, there are the administration manual, oral expression easel, listening comprehension easel, and record forms. There are also 2 different forms of each, Form A and B, for the listening comprehension and oral expression subtests. However, Form B is not listed here. The administration manual states that Form A should be used for students that are using this for the first time, and Form B for students that have already completed the assessment before. The purpose of the OWLS 2, defined broadly, are to help clinicians determine the language processing ability of students. However, we can look at the different purposes on this page. There are a lot of different applications we can see for knowledge about a student's language processing ability, such as informing us as teachers about where a student's strengths and weaknesses are in the actual language processing ability. Further, the OWLS 2 can be used to design interventions for students that are determined to have a language delay or disability impeding their ability to learn. There are 2 types of derived scores that we can get from the OWLS 2. We can see a student's percentile rank compared to their same aged peers or grade level peers, and also we can use the raw score to see how a student performs compared to where they should be at that age, going along with that second point on the screen. There is a lot of information on this slide, so let us tackle it together. As I said before, there are 2 subtests, listening comprehension and oral expression. There are some similarities as far as administering these subtests, the scoring for example. There are also substantial differences. In listening comprehension, the examinee is shown a group of pictures and must point to a picture, whereas in oral expression, the student must verbalize the correct answers. Further, students receive sample items in oral expression and can have an item repeated, but neither of those resources are given to the student in listening comprehension. Now, let us focus on the basal and ceiling for each of the subtests. Actually, both listening comprehension and oral expression have the same basal and ceiling, which makes the administration of the OWLS 2 significantly smoother. For both subtests, as you can see on the screen, an examinee must answer 7 consecutive items correctly to establish a basal. Again, for both subtests, an examinee must incorrectly answer 4 consecutive items to establish a ceiling, or you establish that ceiling at the end of the assessment. Now, let us talk about reliability. The OWLS 2 administration manual describes 4 different types of reliability that they used to ensure that the test had strong reliability. In the section on reliability in the administration manual, we saw that all 4 of these reliability measures that are currently on the screen were determined to have strong efficacy, meaning the data were within the desired ranges for each of those reliability measures. Now let us talk about validity. The 3 types of validity shown on the screen were articulated in the administration manual provided with the OWLS 2 test. The construct validity discussed in the administration manual stated that the test was based on an integrative language theory, and this test was determined to have accurately measured the language processing abilities articulated in the integrative language theory. There was also significant correlation between the language comprehension and oral expression subtests of both the OWLS and the OWLS 2. Finally, discriminative validity states that the test can discriminate students with higher language processing abilities and lower language processing abilities. The administration manual affirms that the test had discriminative validity along with the construct and conversion validities as well. Now, let us talk about the norm groups described in the administration manual. The manual states that 2,123 individuals aged 3 to 21 were used to standardize this test. They closely match the composition of the general U.S. population. However, for students who do not have a strong background in English, this test would be inappropriate to use. Also, Students who require adaptations to the testing materials cannot be compared using the normative information in the manual. This means that students who do not have a strong background in English, or students who require significant adaptations, would not be able to be assessed and scored in the way this test is intended, if at all. Now that we have discussed different facets of the test, let us critique it. After looking at the reliability and validity sections of the OWLS 2 Administration Manual, we found that it does appear to have strong reliability and thus has good score consistency. The scores were reliable against each other over time, and the forms A and B were also reliably compared to each other. Now, let us move towards validity. We also consider the validity measures used in the Administration Manual to be strong. The three types of validity are presented on the screen. The basic premise of the OWLS 2 comes from the integrative language theory, and construct validity measures claimed that this test captured the language processing domains in the items. The manual also stated that the OWLS 2 is compared to the original OWLS, which came back as valid. Finally, and probably the most applicable to us as special educators, is the discriminative validity piece on the final bullet point. The manual claimed to test 241 students diagnosed with speech or language disorders, and the mean of their scores was significantly lower than the control, thus showing that the scores were indicative of the disabilities that they were diagnosed with, and that the OWLS 2 did a sufficient job in testing for language processing abilities. As mentioned before, and right here on this slide, the OWLS 2 is based off the principles of the integrative language theory, and this test appears to test many facets of language processing abilities. Therefore, we determined that the OWLS 2 did a complete job in the subject area of language processing ability. An important part of critiquing a test is to study some of its limitations. We saw two major limitations that were briefly mentioned in the norm group section, but we will further discuss here. The first limitation is that this test would be inappropriate to use on students who do not have a strong background in English. While this makes sense because the test is designed for students who speak English, it places a limit on the effectiveness of this test since there is an increasing amount of culturally and linguistically diverse students in our schools. The second limitation that we saw is with the fact that students that may need adaptations to the test, such as repeating items, these students would not be able to go through the standardized process in the sense that they cannot be compared to the norm reference information described in the manual. This also places a limit on students who need accommodations on tests, such as the OWLS 2. We saw the norm group described earlier in this presentation. However, we found that these data were not very specific. It basically said that it was representative of the population. Maybe we're just scrutinizing it, but it does seem like we should know more information about the norm group than just it is representative of the general U.S. population. If you are administering the OWLS 2, you would find that it is relatively easy to administer it and score it, but the interpretation aspect of testing was rather difficult. Although it is set up well in the administration manual, it requires a lot of moving between pages and even made us confused when we were attempting to review a sample in the manual since there are many different scales to examine, as shown on the slide. We found a strong review of the OWLS test by Hartley et al. This study determined that the OWLS was sensitive to language impairments within various autism spectrum disorder subgroups, including both general linguistic abilities as well as pragmatic use of language. This demonstrated that the OWLS test was receptive to discrepancies in language processing for students with autism. The OWLS 2 was also quite easy to administer, as we said previously. One thing that was confusing when we learned about basals and ceilings in lecture was how to determine them. The OWLS 2 had easy to understand basal and ceiling rules that assisted us in understanding the scoring procedures. One of the strengths that we saw in the OWLS 2 was that the test emphasized culturally sensitive practices. One of the items displayed in the image on the screen asked, "The mom was cooking dinner. Here is the dinner that she," and then you give the response. The natural response would have been cooked. However, some of the alternative dialect responses that were allowed for students who used a different dialect was cook or cooked, which you can also see on the screen. This meant to us that the test understood that there were different ways of pronouncing words and recognized that different dialects would refer to the same ideas in different ways. Here are the references that we used for the Gallery Walk project. Please refer to these if you have any additional questions about the OWLS 2. We thank you very much for listening to our presentation and we hope you learned something new. about the OWLS 2 today.